Ready to go.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this week's installment of our full Budget Committee hearing. We will be, of course, reviewing the Governor's proposed expenditure for cap and trade auction revenues. We'll be first hearing from the legislative analysts who will give us their review of the expenditure plan. Then we'll hear from the administration's approach as to how they reached their plan, and then some legislative considerations that we will all have opportunity to delve into. Before we begin, I want to welcome our committee vice chair, Senator Nielsen. I understand you'd like to say a few words.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate you allowing this hearing and providing some opportunity to comment early on in the budget process. This is a huge undertaking, I think a precedential area that we're embarking upon here, and it's very important for us to determine the legality of what we're trying to do here, what the governor's plan is, what its ultimate long-term effect is going to be, and how it fits in prospectively to the budget process. So I'm looking forward to the hearing and the opportunity to ask questions and to learn.
Thank you, sir. And I'm pleased to see that we're joined by Senator Pavley right on time, because I'm about to make mention that the reason we're here is because of AB 32, which was authored by Senator Pavley when she was in the Assembly. And that bill, as statute, requires that California reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by 2020, and a part of that bill, now statute, gives authority to the Air Resources Board to construct a market-based plan to help initiate and encourage that reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So with that said, I'd like to invite up Tiffany Roberts to present the LAO's analysis of the governor's cap and trade expenditure plan. And welcome, Mr. Frazee.
Good morning, members. I'm Tiffany Roberts from the Ledge Analyst Office, and I'm joined by Jeremy Fress, one of my colleagues from the Analyst Office, and we're happy to be here to go over our cap and trade auction revenue expenditure plan presentation with you. Now, everyone should have a copy of our presentation in your binder, and just by way of overview, let me give you an idea of what I'm going to be addressing here today. I'm going to start out with some background on cap and trade, talk a little bit about how it works, then I'll move on to some points about the auction revenue. I'll briefly go over the governor's cap and trade expenditure plan, and I'll offer a few comments on the plan. Now, I do want to say that we are continuing to work on our analysis of the plan, so it's going to be rather limited in terms of what we're offering as far as feedback on the governor's plan, but nonetheless, we'll have a few comments on it.
And just recently, we've been in receipt of some trailer bill language as well, which I don't imagine you had time to analyze yet.
That's correct. We have had a chance just to, look over it at a high level, but okay. You're absolutely right. So, I will, however, at the end of my presentation, provide some questions that you will want to consider as you deliberate the use of auction revenue, and perhaps even ask the administration here today. So let's go ahead and get started then. I'm on page 1 of the presentation. By way of background, as we know, AB 32 was passed in 2006 and set a limit on the state's greenhouse gas emissions. Requires that we reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by 2020. The legislation also authorized the use of a cap and trade market mechanism. And in 2011, ARB adopted a cap and trade program which effectively put a cap on roughly 85% of the state's emissions. So turning to page 2, just a little bit of background on how the cap and trade program works. So as I mentioned, the cap and trade program sets a limit or a cap on aggregate emissions. And in order to operationalize the cap, in order to make the cap work, what happens is the regulator, in this case ARB, creates an exact number of allowances equal to the cap. So, for example, in a fictitious scenario, let's say that we had a cap of 100 tons of carbon dioxide. ARB would have to create 100 allowances, and each one of those allowances would be valued at 1 ton of carbon dioxide. Next, the regulator then requires that covered entities under the program essentially obtain allowances equal to their emissions. So again, in this fictitious example, let's say we've got a covered entity that emits 5 tons of carbon dioxide on an annual basis. They would then have to get 5 allowances in order to comply with the program. Next, because the cap declines over time, it creates a scarcity. And that scarcity basically serves to put price pressure on the allowances. So essentially you've got covered allowances who are now competing for fewer and fewer allowances. And this is the scenario, the actual market that forces the environmental goal and ensures that we will meet our environmental goal. Okay, so let me move on to page 3 and give you a few key features of California's program. So the state's 2020 greenhouse gas emission target is 427 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. By the time it's fully implemented, there will be roughly 350 companies or entities who are subject to the cap. And over the entirety of the program, as it's currently scheduled, roughly 50% of the allowances would be given away for free, and the other 50% would be auctioned. ARB holds quarterly auctions, and since 2012 has held 5 auctions. Those auctions have raised $532 million for the state. The next auction is going to be next week. It will be February 19th. All right, turning to page 4. Here you've got some legislative direction for the use of revenue. As you see, 3 pieces of legislation have provided some guidance about how to use the revenue. SB 1018 was passed as part of the 12-13 budget, and it created a new special fund, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, and it required that auction revenues be deposited into that fund. It also required that departments spending money from that fund prepare a record specifying the following. And here you've got a list of all of the things that departments are going to have to create a record about prior to expending funds. So the first, they're going to have to provide a description of the proposed expenditures, how the expenditures will further the purposes of AB 32, how expenditures will achieve greenhouse gas emission reductions, how the department has considered other non-GHG activities, that's co-benefits, and then how the department will document expenditure results. Moving on to the next piece of legislation is AB 1532. It's Perez legislation that was passed in 2012, and it directed the Department of Finance to develop and periodically update a 3-year investment plan that identifies feasible and cost-effective greenhouse gas emission reduction investments that can be funded with the cap-and-trade revenue. It also describes sectors into which revenue may be invested. Then lastly, a De Leon legislation from 2012 as well directed that 25% of auction revenue be used to benefit disadvantaged communities, and 10% of auction revenues be invested directly into disadvantaged communities. So moving on to page 5. Here you have a table. Basically, it really mirrors what's in the governor's budget display, but just a few key points. The governor's cap-and-trade plan proposes $31 million from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund in 13-14 in the current year for ARB, and then $850 million from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund in 14-15. The administration also proposes to continue funding most of those programs at an equal level in 15-16. And then, as Mr. Leno mentioned earlier, the proposed trailer bill language that we saw yesterday afternoon would also direct that 1/3 of the funding from auction revenues be continuously appropriated starting in 2015-16. The proposed plan would fund a variety of existing and new programs in 11 state departments. In many cases, those programs have subcomponents. Turning on to page 6, it's just a continuation. The governor's budget also includes a partial repayment of $100 million of a loan from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund to the General Fund in 13-14. And then again, the trailer bill language that we saw yesterday afternoon also provides that when the $400 million is repaid, it would be repaid to high-speed rail.
And that would happen per the trailer bill in 15-16?
It did not designate 15-16 that I recall seeing. It seems that it basically directs that once it's repaid, it should be repaid to high-speed rail. But again, I don't know if there's a specific date. So that might be a question for the administration. The budget also has 10 positions for the Air Resources Board to develop metrics which can be used by departments to evaluate the effectiveness of the expenditures. This would be after the fact, so after those expenditures have been made, the departments would then have those metrics to use to evaluate the effectiveness. The governor's proposed use of cap-and-trade auction revenue can be divided up into 3 categories. The first is transportation and sustainable communities. The second is clean energy and energy efficiency. And the third is natural resources and waste diversion. The largest is the transportation and sustainable communities piece. When we say sustainable communities, we basically mean the SB 375 related activities. Within that $600 million, $250 million goes to high-speed rail, $50 million goes to Caltrans, $200 million goes to ARB, and $100 million would go to the Strategic Growth Council for SB 375 related activities. The clean energy and energy efficiency portion of the budget reflects $140 million. Of that, $80 million would go towards community services and development, weatherization for low-income communities. $20 million would go for Department of General Services, Zero Net Energy, and other energy-related funding. $20 million would go for the Department of Food and Ag's agricultural energy program, and then $20 million for water efficiency as well. And then lastly, the natural resources and waste diversion piece, $110 million in total. $30 million would go for wetlands restoration, $50 million would go for urban forestry, and $30 million would go for waste diversion. So moving on to page 7, let me talk a little bit about why it's important to maximize greenhouse gas emission reductions. So to the extent that you invest in activities that have the effect of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and maximizing greenhouse gas emission reductions, you essentially help to put downward pressure on the price of allowances. That in turn has the effect of reducing the potential economic impact that this program can have, whether it's on consumers or ratepayers or businesses or the economy as a whole. So you'll want to think about how best to maximize your greenhouse gas emission reductions in order to offset the potential negative economic impact of the program.
Ms. Roberts, I want to ask you about that point, that maximizing emission reductions reduces competitions for allowances, and how that intersects with your comment on page 2 that because the cap declines and allowances become more scarce, allowance prices would be expected to increase, which is by design, so that there is incentive for the reduction of the emissions. But they almost seem at
Yeah, the two actually are not at odds. You are just on the natural. I mean, to the extent that the cap declines, you've got a scarcity in place, and so that's going to put upward pressure on the price of allowances. To the extent that you're making really good investments with the cap and trade revenue and maximizing greenhouse gas emission reductions, you're putting downward pressure while at the same time helping to achieve your goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So it's kind of a mix of the two. They aren't mutually exclusive.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Senator Leno?
Yes, Senator Pavlik.
That also caught my attention, and just the price signals. Generally, if you lower the prices, you would probably increase the emissions. I mean, when we see
you're going to have
gas prices go down, people drive more.
Yeah.
So I don't understand
there is going to be
your
a
thinking behind this.
Sure. There is going to be a price signal with this program. There is. And you've got that because of the design of the program. Kind of backing up and even thinking about the way that allowances are distributed. We've talked in the past about the distribution of allowances and the impact that the distribution of allowances may have on your environmental goal. Because of the design of the cap and trade program, it doesn't matter how you distribute the allowances. Because of the interaction between the declining cap and increasing competition for those allowances. It's that dynamic that forces essentially the state to reach its environmental goal. So you'll still have the price signal. Also thinking back, this might be getting a little too in the weeds, but happy to go there. Some of the technical...
We're there with you.
What's that?
We're there with you.
All right, good. From some of the technicalities then, the program includes a set of benchmarks. And so essentially with those benchmarks, those guide the sectoral distribution of allowances. But in the end, essentially all entities that are subject to the cap are going to essentially have to take this 10% haircut of emissions. That's how the program is designed. And that's where your price signal comes from. And so to the extent that you can invest this revenue in a way that reduces some of that price pressure, not reducing the 10%, because you're not going to be able to do that. That is there. You're not going to be able to mute that price signal. But to the extent that you can reduce some of the pressure on allowances, you offset some of the potential negative economic impact of the program.
So they may not be at odds, but it's slightly counterintuitive.
Well, it's competing forces, right? So it's essentially the market at work, and the impact that you see, the results that you see, will basically be determined from actions that the legislature and the administration and the state as a whole take in interacting in that market.
It's the confusion with the language maximizing reductions in concert with this that causes a little bit of confusion.
Okay, all right. So moving on to the next point. Really, at this point, when we've taken a look at what we've got with the governor's expenditure plan, it's unclear the extent to which this complement of activities proposed by the governor would maximize greenhouse gas emission reductions. Specifically, there are a couple of different areas. Obviously, we've got here the high-speed rail piece. It indicates that once the high-speed rail system is operational in 2022, it would contribute a relatively minor amount of greenhouse gas emission reductions to the state. And we would point out that the High-Speed Rail Authority has said that it's going to try to offset those emissions, but you will want to direct some specific questions as to how that might potentially happen. Moving on to the last page, these are some other issues for legislative consideration. Again, getting back to the greenhouse gas reduction levels, and also kind of tagging on to some of the questions that you guys have. I mean, you're familiar with AB 32's provisions about leakage, and so that is one of the things that you'll want to be aware of. To the extent that you can invest in activities that maximize greenhouse gas emission reductions, you're also in line with the language around leakage, this concept, either economic leakage or or carbon leakage to the extent that you're impacting, or the program is impacting the potential market share of any of these companies that are subject to the cap and trade program. They may, at the margin, look for ways to offset their greenhouse gas emissions within California by doing things like expanding in other areas outside of California, or shutting down their business and moving to other areas. So that's one of the things that you'll want to consider. Again, that's just tagging on to some of the questions that you guys had. You'll also want to think about the timing to which each proposal is going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We all know that greenhouse gas emissions remain in the atmosphere for a couple of years, up to over 1,000 years. And so to the extent that you can take early action, the greater the likelihood for addressing some of those particular issues as well. You'll want to think about your legislative priorities. Are these particular activities that are proposed in line with your legislative priorities? You'll want to think about the potential legal risk. What are the legal risk associated with any one of the activities? Probably want to think about it in terms of kind of a risk continuum, where some activities may be more legally risky than other activities. For guidelines and metrics, you'll want to know how the administration is approaching the use of revenue. Do they have a coordinated approach in place? Is it a consistent approach across all of the different departments? Will they be providing metrics potentially beforehand so that the departments could evaluate what the potential impact of any one investment could be, and let that evaluation guide how the funds are expended? You'll want to think about the co-benefits of the potential activities as well, and ask the administration how they've considered co-benefits. Are they quantifying co-benefits? You'll also want to think about the administrative aspects of the plan. Are there going to be any type of implementation challenges that departments are facing in administering these programs? To what extent some of the programs might require coordination? Do they have the adequate resources needed in order to do that type of coordination? And then lastly, you'll want to understand how the departments are going to track and report outcomes, and how that information in turn is going to affect future funding decisions. So those are just some of the questions that you'll probably want to keep in mind as you deliberate the use of the auction revenue. So with that, I will stop, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Roberts. I know we have many questions. Before we get to them, I'm going to ask if we could call the roll, please.
Leno?
Here.
Nielsen? Here. Anderson?
Here.
Bell? Here. Berryhill? Block? Corbett?
Here.
Hancock?
Here.
Jackson? Mitchell? Monin? Roth?
Here.
Torres? Walters? Wright? Wyland? We have a...
Thank you. So many questions. Let me just pick up on one of your last statements, that it might make sense to have metrics developed before the funds are actually distributed. So you don't see that in the current proposal?
It's a good question for the administration. From what we've seen so far, our understanding is that the metrics would be provided after the expenditure of funds, basically for evaluation purposes after the fact.
But keeping in line with your suggestion that it's important, for the reasons we've already discussed, to maximize the greenhouse gas emission reductions, it would seem logical to make sure that those metrics are in place before we even determine how they should be spent.
Yes.
And then it does make sense to then also use metrics to be able to measure the success of those programs after they have been spent.
Absolutely.
You've been pretty clear that you have some concerns, if not doubts, as to the maximization as proposed, and specifically with regard to high-speed rail, if not some of the other transportation expenditures. What about the non-transportation, the natural resources components, for example? Can you assess those for us?
Well, like I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, we're still in the process of doing a lot of our analysis. But just as a guiding principle, what the legislature will want to keep in mind is how well any one of these projects can be quantified. And so to the extent that any one of the projects is presented and the department or the administration is demonstrating some actual quantification of potential greenhouse gas emissions, that could be a guiding principle to use in terms of thinking about how to use the revenue.
In your chart on page 5, where you delineate each of the different programs and activities by department, it looks like Cal Recycle has greenhouse gas reduction targets. Did you find them in any of these other line items? Targets?
We have, so when you say that, you mean within the budget change proposals that were presented?
In each of these programs, for example, the low-emission vehicle rebates, the sustainable communities, do each of these proposals have targets of reduced greenhouse gas emissions?
So again, we're still doing some analysis of that. We have asked for backup literature and data to help try to understand what the potential impact could be. It's true that Cal Recycle did a good job in putting some numbers within the BCP, so you could certainly acknowledge that.
And then lastly, so we can get to some of my other colleagues, how would you maximize? What would be your suggestions for maximizing greenhouse gas reductions?
So that's a great question, and I would say stay tuned to our analysis that is coming out in a couple of weeks.
Drama, drama, drama. We're going to go to Senator Berryhill and then Senator Bell.
Great, thank you. And most of my questions are actually going to be for the EOF, but I am interested in your comments. Thanks for coming, by the way. I'm interested, as you've talked here today, do you have any concerns for the impact on small businesses on what this AB 32 is going to have with the fees and fines? I mean, with revenue loss especially because of the small businesses in the state?
We haven't done any analysis that would specifically address the impact on small businesses. We would just say that as you move forward, you would want to think about the impact of the program as a whole in terms of economy-wide impacts. So to the extent that you put a price on carbon, you are by design increasing the cost of energy, as Ms. Pavley had referred to earlier. And so the intent of the program is to send a price signal. And so to the extent that you're doing that, entities will feel that, whether they're consumers, ratepayers, small businesses, or the economy as a whole.
Oh, they're definitely going to feel it. And I mean, there's many different small businesses that are going to get hurt by this thing, if not ruined. But one in specific, the trucking industry, you know, what this AB 32 is basically doing to our trucking industry, there'll be no small truckers because nobody can afford the retrofits and everything else that's going on. So I think you're going to see instead of us trying to help the small business sectors, we're killing small business sectors, and we're just going to make everybody be big corporate America here before this thing's said and done. So again, thanks for coming today, and I'll have additional questions for the DOF, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Bell and then Senator Wright.
When I studied this, I was interested in, okay, are there alternative scenarios that can match or improve upon the carbon reduction, and how will we evaluate those alternatives compared to this particular plan?
Absolutely. That's
that a question?
Fundamental question, and that is one that we're going to be addressing in the coming weeks with our more in-depth analysis.
Okay, I'd like to see what kind of various alternatives are, and then what kind of criteria would you use to evaluate those alternatives in a consistent manner. The other thing is, I think our chair reflected on this as well. I view this as an expenditure that we're looking at for this year's budget. However, we are beginning the expenditures, so we have to assume that this is more or less a multi-year look at things. I think when reviewing this, it might be important to look multi-year how these programs evolve and whether or not they will last, or they're short-term, one-time expenditures, or ongoing kinds of programs that we want to establish. Because I think once we set these programs, we're going to be into a multi-year approach. So in reviewing this, it might be important to look at multi-year evaluations down the road, even to 2020 and maybe beyond, to see how these programs have impact on reducing carbon emissions. I assume our expenditures, just looking at the various projects and proposals and programs, they're multi-year. Do you agree with that?
It seems that that would be the case, at least what we've seen so far in the governor's budget, that most of the proposals are at least for 2 years, so for the 14-15 budget year as well as budget year plus one, 2015-16.
So I think in terms of our dictates, we have to all analyze those on a multi-year approach, and then look at environmental, economic, fiscal, and social criteria to evaluate this. I had one last question, Mr. Chairman. That's related to the mandate in the legislation on 25% benefit of the money has to be spent to benefit disadvantaged communities, and 10% of the money has to be spent in disadvantaged communities. And when we do analysis of this, I think it's going to be very important to explicitly show which programs are going to be spent in disadvantaged communities, which programs are going to benefit disadvantaged communities, and how much money are we going to spend in each one of the different categories. So, for example, if we have one category that clearly will not definitely benefit disadvantaged communities, that would essentially push the higher percentage onto other programs. Am I correct? So if you have one program that's not going to be in a disadvantaged community in terms of the expenditure, like say high-speed rail or some other program, it doesn't benefit disadvantaged communities, maybe it will cause the other programs to have a higher percentage. Or how would you, are we intended to look at this by having 25% for each program, or will it be higher or lower depending on the various programs? So that's a question I had. Have you looked at that particular question?
Yeah, and I think it's the latter. This is a great question for the administration, but it seems like that's the latter as well. It seems like they're trying to make adjustments so that they are still in line with the law, but of course acknowledging when, for example, they're not able to directly invest in a disadvantaged community. But I would say that the administration would probably do a better job.
Okay, well, when we do this in the future, I think when we have to evaluate this, it's going to be very important to have a column that shows the 25% and the 10%. Okay. So we can understand that this money will be spent in those areas, those disadvantaged communities. So we get like we could say that the food and agriculture program will be spent 25% or 40% or whatever the percentage is in a disadvantaged community.
That makes sense.
That's what I'm talking about, Mr. Chairman. I think because that's our mandate, the law, we should flow with what the direction is, and I'm sure the legislature, especially Senator De Leon, will be interested in that.